Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a systems interrogation of Robert B. Reich's critical 2015 analysis, Saving Capitalism. For the many, not the few.
And our mission here really is to dive deep into the core systemic question that this book forces all of us to confront.
Right. It's this idea that markets aren't some natural force, like the weather.
No.
They're fundamentally structured by human-made rules, by power dynamics, and by law.
Which means if markets are just a set of rules we all agree on, then we as a society have the power to change them.
We do.
But first, you have to even see that the rules are there.
And that's the perception crisis.
Exactly. And this deep dive feels incredibly urgent right now because the current economic structure has produced, well, a really stark and unsettling economic shift.
Reich frames this so well using a simple historical comparison. If you look at the period after World War II, say the 1940s through the 1970s.
The so-called Golden Age.
The Golden Age, right. The American economy doubled in size. But here's the critical part. During that same time, the earnings of the typical worker also doubled.
So they were linked. Growth for the country meant growth for the average person.
Perfectly linked.
Yeah.
And that correlation, that shared prosperity, is what created the largest middle class the world had ever seen. The gains were, broadly shared.
That sounds like the kind of functional economic system we're all sort of told we have.
It's the promise, yeah.
But the system, it broke down somewhere around the late 1970s. Because in the last 30 or 40 years, the economy doubled again.
Productivity just kept soaring. Wealth kept accumulating.
But the earnings, the typical American worker, as Reich puts it, went nowhere. They just stagnated, right, if you adjust for inflation.
Flatlined. And that's the central systemic anomaly we have to explain. Why did growth suddenly decouple from prosperity for the average person?
You can see the outcomes so clearly when you look at where the rewards went instead. The concentration at the very top.
Especially in executive compensation. I mean, in that post-war boom, a CEO of a major corporation earned, on average, maybe 20 times the pay of their typical worker.
20 to 1. Okay.
Which seems high, but, manageable.
Today, that ratio is just a breathtaking illustration of how concentrated power has become.
The source material uses data from 2013, and by then, the ratio was substantially over 200 times.
200.
Specifically, 296 to 1.
Almost 300 times the pay of the average worker. That isn't just a number about personal success. That's a physical representation of how resources are being funneled systematically into this tiny elite segment of the economy.
And that data point, that 296 to 1, is really the physical manifestation of a profound crisis. A crisis in perception and in trust.
Of course. Because when the average person sees their own wages going nowhere year after year, while corporate profits are at record highs and CEOs are getting that kind of pay.
It breeds cynicism, widespread cynicism. You stop believing that hard work or merit is actually going to get you a fair shot.
You start to think the game is rigged.
Exactly. And Reich argues that this is the core threat. The perception that the entire economic and political system is rigged in favor of those at the top. That feeling is what leads to the unraveling of the social contract that holds the whole thing together.
And as always, we want to be absolutely clear with you, the listener. We are here to analyze the machinery.
The architecture of the outcome.
Right. We're looking strictly at systems and structures, how the game is set up, not on judging individual morality or, giving out personal finance advice.
We need to understand the architecture. And to do that, it's really useful to establish some context for the author himself.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Reich is not some academic theorist who's disconnected from policy.
No, he's been on the inside.
Very much so. He's a professor of public policy at Berkeley. But, importantly, he was the Secretary of Labor under President Bill Clinton. He's written 14 major books, including bestsellers like Saving Capitalism.
And I think his history as a political insider is what makes the argument in Saving Capitalism so powerful. Because it represents a huge intellectual shift for him.
It does.
If he's the one arguing the system is engineered, we have to ask, why did he change his mind about what was causing the problem?
That's the crucial question. For years, Reich advocated what he calls the standard explanation for all this economic stress.
Which was?
That it was all about globalization and technological change.
Mm-hmm.
The technology was making the skills of the average worker obsolete, or at least less valuable, because jobs could be automated or outsourced.
And under that diagnosis, what's the solution?
Well, the solution would be an activist government. You raise taxes on the wealthy, on the winners, and then you redistribute those funds to help the workers adapt through education, job training, social safety nets.
That's the classic redistributionist view, right? Fix the outcomes after the market has done its thing.
Precisely. So if that was his solution, a bigger role for government after the market allocates rewards, what did he realize he was missing? What was this critically important phenomenon that made him shift his entire focus?
Hmm.
He realized he had overlooked the increasing concentration of political power in a corporate and financial elite.
So not just economic power, political power.
Yes. This elite hadn't just, benefited from globalization. They had actively used their political leverage to influence and rewrite the very rules of the market.
The fundamental legal architecture.
Exactly. So Reich concluded the issue wasn't a natural market response to technology. It was an engineered one.
Okay, so the problem isn't just about what happens after you earn your income, the taxes and the transfers, what we call redistribution. It's about what's happening inside the market itself.
At the level of the legal rules that decide who gets what in the first place.
And that is the central thesis of the entire book.
That's it. Markets depend completely for their very existence on human-made rules. Rules about what? Rules about property, contracts, monopolies, bankruptcy, enforcement.
About the boring stuff we never think about.
The fine print of the economy. And Reich argues that these rules have been systematically altered over the past few decades to favor those with the most economic and political power.
And the result is what he calls upward predistributions of income.
Predistributions. That is such a vital piece of terminology. We should slow down and really define that.
Okay, so if redistribution is what happens when the government takes income from one group, say through taxes, and gives it to another through welfare or services, what exactly is a predistribution?
A predistribution is the allocation of rewards before taxes and transfers even enter the picture.
So it's rigging the game before it even starts.
It's shifting the goalposts. For instance, let's say large corporations successfully lobby to weaken antitrust enforcement. That lets them build up monopoly power. That monopoly power then allows them to charge you higher prices for their products and pay their workers lower wages.
Right.
That extra corporate profit they make and the wages that were suppressed, that's predistributed wealth. It's been shifted from consumers and workers to shareholders and executives purely because a legal rule was changed.
And because these rule changes are so subtle, I mean, they're buried in administrative law or in court rulings, they've largely, as Reich says, escaped notice.
Completely. Meanwhile, the public debate is engineered to stay focused on the much more visible, much more emotional issue of redistribution.
Taxes.
Which allows the powerful to keep their predistributed gains hidden in plain sight.
Precisely. And this leads directly to Reich's view that the endless political debate over the free market versus an activist government, the tired left-right split,
Is a profound distraction.
a massive act of narrative control. It prevents us from asking the most important question. How are the market rules organized and for whose benefit? The very idea of a free market that exists separate from government, where government intrudes to mess things up, Reich calls that what? A myth.
A damaging and very convenient mythology
Convenient for whom?
for those who benefit from the current rules. That myth serves to protect the status quo. If you see the market as a force of nature, then outcomes like extreme inequality seem natural, inevitable.
But if you acknowledge that the market is a human creation,
Then the inequality becomes a political choice. And if it's a choice, we can change it.
and this is where our deep dive into the systems analysis really has to begin. We have to look past that myth and see the market for what it is, a legal and political construction.
That is the foundation for everything else. There's no such thing as a free market without government. I mean, think about it. Who defines what property is?
Government.
Who enforces contracts? Who stops people from just taking your stuff?
The government, the courts, the police.
Right, so the government doesn't intrude on the market. The government creates the market through its laws and institutions. Thomas Hobbes knew this centuries ago. Competition in a state of nature is just, well, it's just a brawl where the strongest person wins.
Civilization and markets are defined by having rules.
And this is the key. Those rules are not neutral. They're not universal. They're not permanent. They reflect who has the most power to influence them.
So we need to look at how that shift in political power has fundamentally changed the structure of the market.
Which in turn changes the incentives for everyone acting within it.
leading to the unequal outcomes we see today. Let's get into the 5 building blocks that Reich identifies.
Okay, the first building block is property, basically defining what can be owned and under what terms.
Historically, this was pretty straightforward, right? Property was tangible. It was land, tools, factories.
The battles were clear,
Yeah.
like the abolition of slavery. That was a massive, world-altering shift in property rights. What could and could not be owned.
But today, the real complexity is around intangible assets. It's all about intellectual property, or IP. New designs, ideas, software code.
Yes, and the structure of property rights here is constantly being debated and redefined by legislators and by the courts.
So what's the incentive driving this?
Well, the incentive is clear.
Yeah.
You need strong IP rights to motivate inventors and creators, right? To get them to invest time and resources in innovation. If anyone could just immediately copy a new drug or a piece of software,
The incentive to create it in the first place would just vanish.
it would.
Yeah.
However, the outcome, which has been magnified by just intense political lobbying, has been the radical enlargement and entrenchment of these rights. They've created monopolies that go far beyond what's necessary to actually incentivize innovation.
And this has a direct impact on all of us, on access, on pricing. When you maximize ownership like that, prices go up and public access shrinks. The pharmaceutical example from the book is, well, it's devastatingly clear.
It really is. I mean, until the 1990s, you generally couldn't patent products of nature or the basic processes used to create things like early vaccines.
But through concentrated political and legal lobbying, the pharmaceutical companies managed to engineer a structural change.
The huge one. They were allowed to patent the processes they used to manufacture vaccines, even if the vaccine itself was derived from a natural virus.
That legal shift must have changed the entire incentive structure for them.
Completely. Suddenly, the race wasn't just to find a treatment. It was a race to patent the legal pathway to manufacture it, to own the process.
And the outcome of that.
A literal explosion of patent applications, over 10,000 of them. And vaccine prices just escalated dramatically.
All right.
He gives the example of Pfizer's Prevnar 13 vaccine.
Right.
In 2013, because of these patent mechanisms, Pfizer was essentially the only manufacturer. They generated nearly $4 billion in sales from that one vaccine.
That's a profit that was realized not because of some sudden biological miracle.
But because they were successful in rewriting the rulebook on property.
And this pattern, it extends way beyond medicine, right? Into tech, where the rules around software patents are a mess.
A legal thicket, as he calls it. The example of Amazon getting a patent for the simple idea of one-click checkout.
I remember that.
It just shows how far the definition of property has been stretched. It's become purely conceptual.
The system basically enables a whole industry of legal warfare.
Absolutely. Large tech companies now spend vast sums of money just accumulating patent portfolios, not just for defense, but as offensive weapons to use against their rivals.
Reich points out that in 2012, giants like Google and Apple were spending more money on what? On acquiring and litigating patents
Fighting over the ownership of ideas.
than they were on actual basic research and development.
The incentive shifts. It's no longer about innovating for the public good. It's about winning the legal game of ownership. That is a perfect example of pre-distribution of wealth happening through the patent office and the courts.
So if that's what's happening to the rules of property, we have to look at what happens when that concentrated ownership turns into pure market dominance.
Which brings us to the second building block, monopoly, or what degree of market power is permissible.
Defining what's excessive market power. That's a legal choice, right? It's not a law of nature.
It's entirely a legal and administrative choice. It's buried deep inside our antitrust laws, in the enforcement agencies like the FTC and the DOJ, and ultimately in the federal courts. The whole idea of competition hinges on these often invisible decisions.
And the incentive for a powerful company is pretty simple. Extend your market power no matter what.
By any means necessary. They do it through IP, through strategic mergers that swallow up competitors, and by controlling standard platforms or networks, what we sometimes call natural monopolies.
And the outcome is that feedback loop you mentioned earlier?
Yes. Economic power immediately feeds political power. That allows the dominant players to influence the enforcement of the very laws that are supposed to constrain them.
The Monsanto example from the book illustrates this perfectly. How IP and monopoly power can merge to give one company control over an entire sector of the economy.
Monsanto owned the key genetic traits in over 90% of the soybeans and 80% of the corn planted in the U.S.
Through their patented seeds.
Yes, they're genetically modified seeds. But the monopoly wasn't just built on the patent. It was built on the contract.
How so?
Their licensing agreements required farmers to buy new seeds every single season. The crops that grew from those seeds were sterile. They couldn't be replanted.
So they called it Terminator technology.
Exactly. So by controlling the genetic traits and the terms of the purchase contract, Monsanto didn't just sell a product. They set a de facto industry standard. They controlled huge swaths of American agriculture through a property right.
So these new monopolies are much harder for us to see than, say, the old railroad trusts. They're embedded in genetic codes, in digital platforms, and in the fine print of contracts.
And that control lets them dictate terms to everyone, to their suppliers, to farmers, to us as consumers, which leads us right to the third building block.
Contracts, the terms of exchange.
Right. Capitalism, it relies on contracts. But contracts only work if you have rules about things like fraud, coercion, and enforcement. The rules are supposed to ensure that the terms are, at least in theory, fair.
But the structure of modern contracts is, well, it's far from a meeting of equals. It's usually dictated entirely by the party with all the power.
Think about any major financial service agreement, or those 50-page digital contracts you click agree to without ever reading.
That's called freedom of contract on paper, but in reality, it feels more like forced assent.
And the incentive for large corporations is to use their massive legal resources to ensure that these one-sided, non-negotiable agreements are enforced to maximize their advantage.
So the outcome, as Reich puts it, is the erosion of genuine freedom of contract for anyone with less power. That means employees, customers, small franchisees.
This is where the whole concept of liberty gets really suspect. The book notes that this supposed freedom of contract is often a cruel joke, especially when employees are bound by terms that mandate forced arbitration.
Right, where you waive your constitutional right to a trial in court just to get or to keep a job.
And this forced arbitration is a massive pre-distribution of risk and power. When you can't sue as a class or even individually in a public court.
Corporate wrongdoing becomes much cheaper.
Exactly. The incentive to follow the rules is lowered because enforcement is now privatized, it's secret, and it's stacked in the corporation's favor.
You can see this playing out in the granular reality of working conditions, too. The book talks about corporations that use monitoring systems to limit bathroom breaks to 6 minutes a day.
Which they celebrate as free enterprise and efficiency.
But how does Reich frame that in terms of liberty?
He frames it as a massive reduction in the liberty of the workers. It forces you to ask the really essential question. Whose freedom are we actually talking about here? The freedom of the powerful to write the rules and maximize their profit? Or the freedom of the average person to have some basic dignity in negotiating power?
The current structure seems to enable the former at the expense of the latter.
Without a doubt.
Okay, let's move on to the fourth building block, which is bankruptcy. Dealing with what happens when you default.
This is the mechanism that decides how debt and obligations are handled when things inevitably go wrong. And it reflects a really difficult trade-off, right, between forgiving the debtor so they can get a fresh start and honoring the obligations to the creditors.
But the complexity of bankruptcy law is also where power can exert its most subtle influence.
Oh, absolutely. The incentive for powerful interests, especially Wall Street banks, large credit card companies, is to shape the law to guarantee that they can recoup their losses and that their claims get priority, while the burden of failure gets pushed onto someone else.
And the evidence of that political influence is just staggering.
It is. When the 2005 bankruptcy bill was being debated, the credit card industry alone spent over $100 million lobbying Congress.
$100 million.
And that financial firepower, combined with the campaign contributions from Wall Street, it basically ensured that the laws were rewritten to protect creditors no matter the social cost.
So the outcome is this massively tilted playing field that treats corporate failure completely differently from personal failure.
Yes. Big corporations can easily use Chapter 11 bankruptcy to get rid of huge burdens, like their pension obligations to former employees. You see it with airlines, steel companies. They just shed decades of promises they made to their workers.
But ordinary citizens can't use bankruptcy to reduce their most crushing debts, specifically mortgages that are underwater or crippling student loan debt.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is there a structural difference?
Because the laws were engineered that way. That 2005 bill, influenced by all that lobbying money, made it much, much harder for ordinary Americans to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and discharge credit card debt.
And student loans.
Student loan debt has been systematically protected from being discharged for decades. It ensures that the financial institutions holding all that debt face almost no risk. The law protects wealthy corporate interests from the consequences of their bad bets while leaving the average person stuck. That is upward predistribution built right into the system's default mechanism.
Okay, so the final building block is enforcement. How do you make sure everyone actually plays by these rules?
Well, rules about property, monopoly, contracts, bankruptcy, they're all meaningless if they're not enforced.
Mm.
And the choices about what to enforce and how to enforce it are profoundly political decisions.
Enforcement depends on the budgets and the priorities of police, prosecutors, the courts, administrative agencies.
And here again, large corporations and banks use their political leverage to make sure the enforcement mechanism is tilted in their favor or that they face, totally inadequate penalties when they do get caught.
Which is why we see these massive financial institutions pay huge fines, but almost no top executives ever face criminal charges.
It's because the rules of enforcement have been quietly rewritten through political capture. And the courts have played a big role too. Supreme Court decisions have made it harder for groups, consumers, employees to band together in class action lawsuits to enforce the law against giant corporations.
So, to sum up, every single pillar of the market, property, monopoly, contracts, bankruptcy, and enforcement, is not some feature of nature.
Not at all. It is the result of continuous, subtle political decisions that systematically modify the rules to disproportionately benefit those who already have the most wealth and power.
Which brings us directly to how this concentration of power actually works. It's not about, bags of cash in back rooms. It's about systemic influence.
That's the key insight of the systems mapping section of the book. Wealthy interests rarely use direct, obvious bribes anymore. Instead, they influence the making and the enforcement of the market rules through these systematic, professionalized means, like massive campaign contributions, hiring armies of lawyers and paid experts to influence the administrative rulemaking process, expensive lobbying efforts in Washington and state capitals, and of course the promise of future lucrative employment, the infamous revolving door.
Okay, so let's map the actors and the incentives in this feedback loop. On one side, you've got the elite actors,
Right.
large corporations, Wall Street banks, the very rich.
And their incentive is very straightforward. Advance rules that enlarge corporate profits, that boost their stock prices, and as a result, increase executive pay and their own personal fortunes.
And on the other side of that, you have the political actors, legislators, courts, administrative agencies.
Their incentive is to respond to the policy demands and, crucially, the financial support provided by the wealthy. In our campaign finance system, which is just constantly hungry for cash, political capital is intrinsically linked to financial capital.
And we have objective data that shows the outcome of this influence. Reich brings up the Gillens and Page study.
A landmark study.
It analyzed almost 2,000 policy issues, and it concluded that the policy preferences of the average American have what was the phrase? A minuscule, near zero impact on public policy.
Near zero. Lawmakers, instead, overwhelmingly respond to the desires of wealthy individuals and big business interests.
And this systemic reality, it's allowed to persist because of incredibly effective narrative control.
Yes. The proponents of the current system, the ones who benefit the most from the rules, they actively divert public attention away from how the rules are even generated and changed.
That's where the market versus government debate comes in. It's the primary distraction.
It conceals the real question, which is whom is the government for and whose interests do the rules serve? It's a perfect obfuscation.
Because by focusing the public on a simplistic choice between less government and more government, you distract them from looking at the complex, often really technical rulemaking process that is actually deciding who gets rich and who doesn't.
And that concealment is the engine that drives the vicious feedback loop. It's a self-perpetuating mechanism that ensures the system just tilts further and further toward the wealthy, compounding inequality over time.
Can you walk us through that loop again, just simply and clearly, so we can all grasp its destructive power?
Sure. It operates in two reinforcing stages. Stage 1, economic dominance feeds political power.
So as wealth concentrates at the top, he cites corporate profits in 2014 being the highest share of the economy in 85 years. That gives the wealthy more capacity for political influence.
More money means a louder voice and greater access. Simple as that.
And stage 2.
Political power enlarges economic dominance. The political institutions they've influenced then organize the market by changing those 5 building blocks we talked about to disproportionately benefit the wealthy, which further enhances their wealth.
Which gives them even more political power to influence the rules.
And the cycle just reinforces itself. It is a system engineered to reproduce and increase inequality.
This is why the issue of concentrated power isn't new. Reich draws this direct, compelling historical parallel to the late 19th century, the era of the robber barons.
Yes, that period saw such concentrated corporate power that it prompted these deep anxieties about whether democracy itself could even survive.
The warning from that era is just chillingly relevant. He quotes Edward G. Ryan, who was the Chief Justice of Wisconsin Supreme Court back in 1873. He looked at the rising power of corporations and he asked this foundational question.
Which shall rule wealth or man, or the feudal serfs of corporate capital?
It highlights that we are, once again, facing a crisis defined by concentrated economic power, translating into authoritarian political control over the rules of the game.
We are. But what defined that successful, broadly prosperous mid-century economy, the one where wages doubled along with productivity, was the existence of something called countervailing power.
Okay, what is that?
From the 1930s to the late 1970s, you had groups like strong labor unions, local small businesses, and civic organizations that successfully offset and balanced the power of big corporations. They forced the system to share the gains.
And the structural damage today is so evident in the disappearance of that countervailing power. I mean, look at unions.
Union membership has just collapsed. And it mirrors almost perfectly the decline in the middle-class share of total income.
The book has a graph that shows this, right? Two lines on a chart, one for union membership and one for the middle class's share of income, and they just fall together in lockstep.
It is a shocking illustration of a direct correlation. This is not a coincidence. It is hard evidence of a structural breakdown in worker bargaining power.
And the political clout gap now is just staggering. Corporations now spend something like $56 on lobbying for every $1 spent by labor unions.
And to put that influence into perspective, the Koch brothers' political network alone spent more than twice what the 10 largest labor unions spent combined in the 2012 election cycle. Over $400 million of directed political influence from one network.
Meanwhile, the mechanisms of grassroots organization have also just withered away. Civic groups have declined.
Right. The sociologist Robert Putnam documented this. Americans stopped being joiners. As wages stagnated, people had to work more and more just to make ends meet, which meant less time for civic engagement.
So local grassroots organizations were replaced by these national top-down advocacy groups, which are often much easier for politicians to just ignore.
So when we look at the system today, it's not just that power is concentrated at the top. It's that the organized opposition to that power has been systematically disassembled. The system has been engineered to eliminate friction.
Which means now we have to look at the immediate present-day consequences of this engineered structure on our economy and our society.
Let's start with the state of contemporary labor markets. The collapse of worker bargaining power has led to this radical decoupling of productivity and pay. It's just indefensible under the old rules of growth.
The numbers are so stark. Since 1979, the nation's productivity rose a massive 65%.
But median worker compensation, the typical person's take-home pay rose by a mere 8%.
8%. So that means almost all the gains from economic growth have been successfully pre-distributed to the top through these rules governing IP, monopoly, and contracts.
And this shift fundamentally alters the whole dynamic of the workforce. Workers are no longer driven by opportunity and the promise of advancement. They're driven by fear and insecurity.
And corporate executives who are focused on pleasing financial markets, they have both the incentive and the power to seek ever lower labor costs. Suppressing wages translates directly into maximized shareholder returns and, of course, astronomical executive pay.
This is the mechanism that's behind the rise of the working poor. You have entire sectors, retail, food service, the gig economy, that now employ people at wages that keep them perpetually struggling.
And the prime example from the book is Walmart.
It is. While the CEO was getting over $20 million in 2012, the accumulated wealth of the Walton family, who own the majority of the stock, exceeded the combined wealth of the bottom 40% of all American families.
That is just an astonishing juxtaposition. You have poverty alongside unimaginable wealth accumulation, and it's a wealth that isn't based on management effort, but on the structural benefit of having the power to keep labor costs suppressed and retail dominance unchecked.
And at the same time, you see the rise of the non-working rich, whose wealth accumulates much faster through investments than through earned income, largely because they invested in the political influence to shape the rules around property and capital gains in their favor.
So the meritocratic ideal that your earnings are correlated with your effort has been completely divorced from reality in both directions. The rich earn more through power, and the working poor earn less despite their effort.
Now, we also have to talk about the implications for corporate consolidation and financial risk. The 2008 bailout of Wall Street provided this implicit, unspoken guarantee that the largest banks are now too big to fail.
That's a structural certainty now, not just a possibility.
And that implicit guarantee functions as a massive, hidden subsidy. Since the big banks know they'll be rescued, their borrowing costs are lower than the costs for smaller banks.
Which is a competitive advantage that lets them grow even bigger and consolidate even more control over the financial sector.
It incentivizes them to take on greater risk. It creates this perverse structure where the rewards, the massive profits, are privatized and captured by the elite actors. But the risk of failure is completely socialized. It's borne by the taxpayer. The structural integrity of the entire financial system remains compromised by this pre-distributed advantage.
And finally, all of this structural rigging, it contributes so much to our intense political polarization and public confusion.
The dominant political divide is falsely framed, right?
Right.
It's free market efficiency versus government inefficiency. This powerful false dichotomy prevents the majority, the 90% who are losing ground, from forming a unified political alliance to actually change the rules.
It's a systemic checkmate. If you believe the problem is government, you're going to oppose the very regulatory action you need to constrain corporate power.
And if you believe the problem is the market, you overlook the political engineering behind it. It's the perfect diversion.
And this public confusion, this pervasive sense that the game is unfair, it manifests in society as widespread rule breaking, petty theft, fraud, kickbacks. Because people feel the system itself lacks integrity.
And Reich argues this isn't a moral failing, it's a systemic consequence. This rule-breaking then forces economic resources to shift away from productive activities and toward protection, more legal costs, more security, more auditing.
It turns the economy into what he calls a negative-sum game, where society as a whole loses efficiency just trying to guard against the outcomes of its own rigged structure.
And this entire analysis of systemic failure and manufactured perception links so directly to the core themes we explore here on crisis in perception.
Absolutely. The first key link is the rejection of individual blame, which is always reinforced by the meritocratic myth.
Right. The standard narrative is that CEOs or Wall Street executives are simply worth their immense pay packages because they have unique skills or talent. It's a tautology that justifies the structure.
But Reich shows this is just a manufactured logic.
The soaring compensation has less to do with the measurable value of their skills. I mean, the 296-to-1 ratio didn't exist 50 years ago, and CEOs were presumably skilled back then too, and I have everything to do with their increasing power to set the rules that enrich themselves.
So the book forces us to perceive that widening inequality is not the natural, inevitable result of individual failure or a lack of education or even technological progress.
It's the direct consequence of engineered structures designed to allocate rewards to the top. Your structural position has become far more important than your individual effort.
And the second connection is how our perception is shaped by institutional narratives, particularly in how inequality gets framed. The powerful narrative that inequality is inevitable is constantly reinforced by the very people who benefit most from the rules they help set.
And they achieve this narrative control by deliberately focusing the public debate almost entirely on taxes and transfers on redistribution, what happens after the market outcome.
Which diverts our attention from the real lever of power, the predistribution. We rarely talk about how a court decision on patent law allocates wealth. We only argue about what tax bracket it should fall into later on.
The predistribution escapes our notice because the changes are often found deep inside specialized administrative law or complex court rulings, far away from public scrutiny or the evening news. By keeping the spotlight on the tax debate, the systemic rigging, the real source of the problem remains hidden.
Finally, this analysis forces us back to the roots of the political economy perspective.
After World War II, under the influence of Keynesian economics, the focus shifted away from these structural questions. It became all about taxes and transfers to stabilize the business cycle.
And for decades, rapid growth and widespread prosperity meant we didn't really have to worry about the organization of the political economy because the system seemed to be working for pretty much everyone.
But that Keynesian formula growth plus widespread prosperity has definitively failed in the current system. We now have to return to examining the political economy, which, historically, studied how laws and political institutions relate to moral ideals, including a fair distribution of income and wealth. We are now compelled to look at the political organization that sets the stage for these unequal economic outcomes.
So let's bring this deep dive to a close by reflecting on what this book helps us see differently about markets, power, and our own responsibility.
I think the key lesson is the absolute necessity of dispelling the free market mythology once and for all. We have to recognize the underlying human choices that govern those five building blocks: property, monopoly, contracts, bankruptcy, and enforcement.
The current concentration of wealth is a result of political power. It's not pure merit, it's not a natural market force.
And that reality is neither inevitable nor irreversible. Reich actually offers a genuine sense of historical optimism.
Also,
America has a long, messy history of saving capitalism from its own excesses. Whether it was the Jacksonians targeting the special privileges of elites, the progressives enacting antitrust laws against the giant trusts, or the New Dealers limiting Wall Street's power and enlarging the countervailing power of labor unions.
we've structurally corrected our course before.
We have. So the challenge today, then, it isn't primarily economic or technological. Technology promises abundance, just as Keynes predicted nearly a century ago. The real challenge is to democracy. We have to change the allocation of political power that allows an economic elite to control the rules and thus predistribute the nation's wealth to themselves.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on everything we've just discussed.
The critical debate for our future is not about the size of government, but fundamentally about whom government is for.
The central choice facing society is between a market that is organized for broadly based prosperity, where the gains from growth are widely shared, like they were in the post-war era, and one that is designed, as our current system appears to be, to deliver almost all the gains to a very few at the top.
And the only way to achieve that better outcome is for the majority, the 90% who have lost ground, to recognize their common interests, to reorganize and to unify, thereby establishing the countervailing power that has disappeared, and in doing so, saving capitalism by making it work for the many.
That deep dive was based on the systems-level analysis presented in Saving Capitalism. For the Many, Not the Few, by Robert B. Reich.
We encourage you to read the book or borrow it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.